It's a pleasure to be here. First, I want to acknowledge and thank Grant Abbott, who is the person who invited us here. It's an honor to be here with Tina, presenting on a topic that's near and dear to our hearts. And we have worked very hard to try and provide an in-depth overview for you in a short period of time, and hope that you find it beneficial. I also want to thank all of you who chose to come today to listen to this, and a special shout out to my mother, who is sitting right there, and my oldest sister there. Thank you very, very much for coming. And you have a special family member too.
I do. I have my father-in-law and my mother-in-law right here, who just got back from Spain. So
oh, those poor
home.
things. Okay, so let's get going here. We're going to talk about dual language and immersion education, and as I mentioned, we're going to co-present, so we're going to switch back and forth voices here. An overview for this presentation is we'll start with to orient you on dual language and immersion education, the basics, what is it, and why do it. Then we're going to move specifically into academic achievement research findings. We'll look at state level, large and small scale studies from 3 states in particular, North Carolina, then Louisiana, and finally Oregon. And then we're going to shift to Minnesota and talk a little bit about the dual language and immersion story as it has evolved in the Minnesota context. We'll try to present a snapshot of some of the things we're learning in terms of academic achievement in Minnesota. Tina will share with us more in depth about the Pierre Botineau French immersion experience, and we will conclude with a call for Minnesotans within this particular program context.
Is it easier for everyone if we're behind the podium and using the mic?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we'll do our best here. We would like to invite you together to come to an immersion school with us for just a moment. We're going to be going to a Mandarin immersion classroom so that you can experience for just a few seconds what thousands of students across the country get to experience every day.
Mm-hmm. And this is a clip from the video that Grant mentioned. And those of you that have these small cards, you can take a quick look at this video. It's only 15 minutes, definitely worth your time, and please share with others as well. We're going to be entering into the classroom of Shi Lao Shi. Shi Lao Shi is a 4th grade Mandarin immersion teacher at Xinxing Academy in the Hopkins School District. We're going to be seeing a little bit of what she's doing as she is teaching her 4th graders one of our engineering units on maglev and transportation systems, just to give you a sense of what it's like to be an immersion student.
Okay, and now with just a tiny taste of that in your mind, I want to talk about the common program features for all dual language immersion programs. And this picture, by the way, is from Pierre Botineau and in a kindergarten class from a couple of years ago. The first thing that you need to know about all dual language immersion programs is that students in them study all their basic subjects: language arts, math, science, social studies. They do it all within the context of learning through a language other than English, and that they spend at least 50%, if not more, of their day in that novel language. Another important key factor in the program, all dual language immersion programs, is that teachers and staff take extra care to use strategies that ensure that students understand, comprehend fully both the content that they're learning and the language that they're learning it through. And this is Tara Fortune's ABCs. of dual language immersion programs. They have 3 lofty goals. One of them is high, the A stands for high academic achievement. The B stands for all the programs aim for bilingualism and biliteracy. That means that students are not just learning how to speak another language, they're learning how to understand it, speak it, and read and write it at high levels. And then finally, the C stands for cultural competence. What we're aiming to do in dual language immersion programs is ensure that our students understand deeply other cultures and are able then to be participants, full participants in our global community. Okay, these are the 4 different programs that you'll find across the country, and actually these are also easily found, many of these in Canada as well. The first, and they all follow along this continuum, so if you look at the green arrow on the bottom, you'll see the programs off to the left aim to revitalize and support cultures. The programs in the middle are about maintaining cultures and languages, and then finally we find ourselves on the other end where their aim is enrichment. So the first one here is heritage or indigenous language immersion programs. 2 near to us examples would be Ojibwe and Dakota immersion programs. The one that's pictured here is actually Hawaiian. There's many examples of that. Next, we have developmental bilingual education programs, and these are different than simply developmental bilingual literacy programs within schools, because not only are they 50% of the day, remember, but it's also something that's maintained throughout all years of elementary school. Next we have something that's very big all over the state of Minnesota right now. I would call it booming. And these are the dual language immersion programs, where you have a 1-to-1 ratio of students who have different home languages, English and Spanish, and they are on a trajectory to become proficient in the other language. So if you can imagine, the English students in a dual language immersion program are, their home language is English, are aiming to be Spanish proficient, whereas the Spanish home language are aiming to become English proficient. And then finally, one-way world language immersion programs, such as the Chinese immersion that you got a teeny glimpse of, and the Pierre Bottino French immersion program. Little news flash for you. Give you a second to soak it in. You find more and more news articles about the benefits of being a fully bilingual person. Okay, and advantages of dual language immersion programs. We are going to spend a considerable amount of time talking about the academic benefits in detail, citing studies in different states, so we'll get into that in just a minute. The next one, though, is linguistic, and this is a little more complicated than you might think. It's actually a 1, 2, 3. Students in dual language immersion programs not only do they attain high levels of proficiency in the new language, in fact, it is the most efficient and effective school-based language learning program. Think about that for just a second. It's almost intuitive, right? If you're immersed in the language, you're going, at an early age, you're going to get very good at that language. That's the number 2. But then think about this also. It also increases your understanding of your own language, and students who participate in dual language immersion programs find it much easier to add a 3rd language later on. Another thing that students in dual language immersion programs get is a deep understanding of language itself. Imagine your curious mind is constantly at work trying to make sense of your surroundings and your input, and you are being immersed in 2 whole sets of language, each with a system, each with its own rules. And so one thing that is well documented is that students who study in 2 languages through dual language immersion have a deep sense that languages are systematic and that there are rules to follow, and this ends up being a key to developing literacy. Another thing that dual language immersion students have is a perceptual advantage. They have enhanced listening skills and a finely tuned ear for language. Identity is another benefit. This is especially true for, if you can imagine back those 4 bubbles again, the Indigenous and Heritage Language Immersion programs, because their culture is on display and highly prized at school. This is also true for the language minority students or the Spanish home language students in the dual language immersion programs, again, because their culture, their language is prized in the school setting. There are a lot of studies about the cognitive benefits of being a highly competent bilingual. And remember that this is dual language immersion program is the best path to get you headed in the direction of becoming bilingual. And these 2 main findings are that nonverbal problem-solving skills and the ability to block out distracting information when tackling complicated tasks are 2 cognitive benefits. Finally, employment. And I think this is increasingly important for this generation and the generations yet to come. We need people who can speak more than 1 language, are competent in more than 1 culture. And it comes with employment benefits. Academic achievement. This is where we're going to go into a substantial section and a deep dive on academic achievement as seen through several studies in several different states. But first, we have 3 bullets for you that kind of summarize many years of research. The first one is this. I'll give you a second with it. It's 40 years of research. Back up this statement. In other words, students participating in dual language immersion programs from a variety of academic abilities are able to achieve as well as or better than their non-immersion peers, plus, and this is a big plus, they come out of the programs highly functionally proficient in a new language. The next bullet point here is supported by a much smaller amount of studies, but it has been replicated over the course of 35 plus years. And that is research that shows that students from all different backgrounds, both socioeconomic, linguistic, and ethnic backgrounds, are successful in these programs. And the final bullet point here of summary before we get into the details of some specific studies is one that was first done 15 years ago. 2-way immersion programs develop higher levels of proficiency in English and the partner language for English language learners as compared to English language learners in English-only programs. That they also are linked to increased academic language proficiency and successful schooling experiences. And now I'm going to invite Tara to come on down and talk to us in detail about North Carolina.
Okay, let me see here. Okay, it's already on. Wonderful. Thanks, John. The one thing that I want to mention before I get into the state level data is it is important to understand that dual language and immersion education and these programs in the United States would not exist if they were not able to evidence the academic achievement goal. There is less interest nationally, believe it or not, funding things like ethnic identity or bilingualism and biliteracy in the United States. There's less interest in that than there is in finding ways to support academic achievement. What we have learned is that there is a direct and very important relationship between developing a sense of who you are ethnically, right? Who you are as an Ojibwa person. And that has a direct and positive impact on your ability to achieve long-term not only some level of proficiency in your Ojibwa ethnic language, right, but also to achieve better in English long-term. Okay? That is the key. That's what dual language and immersion is actually doing, and that's why we're seeing increased support for it. That's a really, I think, important thing to keep in mind. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about a study, relatively new study. It's important because most of our data on achievement results in dual language and immersion education, when it comes to large-scale studies, has not been carried out in the US context specifically. North Carolina was able to hire Virginia Collier and Wayne Thomas, who are well-known researchers in education in the United States, to take a look specifically at dual language and immersion achievement in the state of North Carolina. What we're going to be looking at are how did students do from a variety of subgroups when they looked at end of grade assessments. So the North Carolina end of grade assessments are equivalent to our Minnesota MCA data, okay? We're looking at data from 6 different districts, specifically looking at two-way bilingual immersion data, okay, that two-way model that Tina was just talking about, where we're bringing students together from 2 different home language backgrounds to learn about each other's languages and cultures. There are 11 Spanish-English two-way programs and 1 Mandarin-English two-way program in this data set. Some of the programs were 50-50. That means throughout the elementary years, half of the instructional day was in Spanish or Mandarin, the other half was English. Okay? There's also a few programs that were 90-10, meaning 90% of the instructional time in kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade was in the non-English language, 90%. And these children are taught initial literacy in that non-English language as well. Okay, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. There's 2 different models here that we're looking at. We'll be looking at data from grades 3 through 8. It's cross-sectional data, not longitudinal. And the data set is almost 86,000 students. So again, a large-scale study. Before I show you the study findings, and unfortunately, this is part of the story that is not being told well, but is absolutely critical in terms of contextualizing these findings. This bar graph here shows us that, actually it doesn't show us this, I'll give you a little background. About 2/3 of the students, both in the dual language immersion programs that are participating in those programs and that are not participating in those programs but that are part of this data set, about 2/3 of them are in fact students of color. The students of color white ratio for the dual language students would be 68% students of color to 32% white students. When it comes to the non-dual language immersion group, it would be 63% students of color relative to 37% white students. Okay, so similar. However, there's an important difference in these 2 groups. Twice as many Hispanic students are participating in the dual language immersion program. And in contrast, almost twice as many African American students are in the non-dual language and immersion context. Okay? Context is everything, so I want you to hold that in mind. The next thing that I want to do to help contextualize the data that I'll be sharing is to have you look at the actual numbers. Okay? When I originally shared, almost 86,000 students are in this data set. My guess is you weren't really thinking that these would be the numbers of the dual language and immersion students versus non. Okay? Very important to keep this in mind. You can see the numbers of students participating in the dual language immersion program is relatively small, right? In fact, the dual language immersion students are only making up between 1% and 2% of all students at each grade level. It's also evident by looking at these data here, the way they're represented, the demographic data, that there are progressively fewer numbers of dual language immersion students in the older grades. Okay? This can be explained by a variety of factors. I don't know which one of what one of these factors best explain, because that's not shared in the data that, or in the write-ups of these studies. But it could be that students are opting to leave the program early, especially after the elementary. It could be the difference between leaving at grade 5 and who continues on to the grade 6 middle school program. It could be that there's no continuation immersion program offered at the secondary, because these are relatively new programs in North Carolina. Or it could be that as more dual language and immersion programs open in the early grade levels, right, more classes are opening for those early grades, we're seeing higher numbers in the early grades, okay? That could help to explain what we're seeing there. In this slide, I want to call attention to the relative percentage of students participating in the programs by subgroup. Okay? So you see here English learners, African American children, white children, and low-income children, children with low socioeconomic background. Okay? We're going to take a look at, and you can see the relative percentages of students by grade level. Notice that students with high educational risk factors, such as being an English learner, student of color, or economically disadvantaged, never make up more than 50% of the data set for any grade level. That's actually very important to keep in mind when I share the data findings, the results of the study. In addition, there are relatively more white students, especially in grades 6, 7, and 8. Again, it's very important to really understand the broader demographic context for these findings. Okay, now that you've got that, I'll show you the findings. And again, keep in mind, when North Carolina folks share this, they do not share what you just saw. I've never yet seen this study presented in that context. It's a good thing to keep in mind. Let's take a look at Anglo-American achievement in these programs. Here you're going to see we're looking at reading versus math, grades 3 to 8, and these are the scale scores from the end of grade North Carolina tests, okay? Green bar is the achievement of our non-dual language students. The red bar is showing the relative achievement of our dual language students. These are average. Researchers compared means to determine the statistical difference between these two groups at each grade level. And in addition, they used a measure of effect size that is a measure used to determine how important are these differences, right? It's one thing to say there are differences, but it's another thing to say the differences were at least 0.25, which says the differences were in the moderate, almost moderate range, right? In other words, these differences are significant enough to inform policy making when it comes to education, okay? So we can see just by looking at this, eyeballing it, we can see that there are differences and that the advantage is going to the Anglo-American students in the dual language immersion context. I've now highlighted which grade levels the differences prove to be significant at, okay? And you can see the differences in math. There were more significant differences in math for the Anglo-American than in reading. One other way that they look at these findings, these researchers, Thomas and Collier, is to summarize it in terms of how much ahead of peers they're performing. So in grades 4 to 8, these Anglo-American or white students are performing about 1 year ahead of their peers in reading and more than a year ahead in math. So those are important differences. The next group we're going to look at are our African American students. Data displayed the same way. Again, the green bars are our non-dual language immersion students that are African American. Red bar dual language immersion students that are African American. Reading versus math. And here we see that the differences are significant at every grade level, both in reading and in math for our African American student population. They also add in reading, grades 4 and beyond, math 5 and beyond, African American students participating in the dual language immersion program are performing more than 1 year ahead of their peers in the non-dual language immersion program. Impressive gains. Back to news flashes, because we've really been seeing a lot, if you've been attending to it in the last 5 to 10 years, especially the last 5 years, it's almost on a daily basis when you'll see somebody talking about the benefits of bilingualism and its relationship to schooling. Here's a recent one speaking 2 languages even benefits low-income children. So let's take a look at the findings from North Carolina. Here's our low-income children, economically disadvantaged in the non-dual language versus dual language, and once again you see similar findings. These findings were significant at every grade level when it came to reading, and in all but one, grade 6, in the area of math. An additional summary statement in reading and math, grades 5 to 7, economically disadvantaged dual language immersion students are performing 1 or more years ahead of their peers. They went on to write that low socioeconomic students are not only hurt by participating in these programs, but in fact, those students who may need additional cognitive development, who may need more comprehensible and interesting instruction and additional motivation to engage with schooling, this particular program model may provide some unique advantages for that particular student group. Newsflash. Next America, early childhood bilingualism can help close learning gaps for immigrant students. I'll let you take this quote in. And let's go back to the North Carolina data on English learners. Again, non-dual language versus dual language reading math findings across the grades. Significant differences in grades 3 through 8 in the area of reading, and in every grade except 6 in the area of math. One of the things to keep in mind, again, going back to the demographic data, and these researchers actually do write about this, and that is that especially in grades 6 through 8, findings really are very tentative because of the particularly low numbers. Something to keep in mind about English learners in dual language and immersion contexts, and this study also found this, which is that there are smaller gains in those early primary grades. So we're talking about grades K through 4. We tend to see smaller achievement gains when we compare dual language immersion to non-immersion students in those early years. When we really begin to see the impact of that dual language and immersion education is really in grades 5 and up. And we're going to see that again and again. So it points to the critical importance of not being too short-sighted, which is very difficult in today's assessment and accountability context. What we do is we have people that are saying, we just flooded these students, these English learners, with all of this great literacy instruction, and then we measured their growth from grade 1 to 2, or from grade 2 to 3, and look at all the difference it makes. We figured it out, eureka. No, short-sighted. There's no eureka there. We have a huge amount of data and meta-analyses that have really thoughtfully looked at English learners and their achievement needs. And the overwhelming evidence continues to find that this learner group benefits from initial instruction and literacy development in their first language before too quickly transitioning them and expecting them to learn in and through English. So long-term view, if we're looking for a quick fix, dual language and immersion isn't it. Long-term view. Finally, when it comes to the North Carolina, I think this is so critical to keep in mind, and I think these researchers did a good job pointing to it. They point to the importance of professional development at the state level. They partnered with, these programs have been partnering with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction so that they've got sufficient professional development and networking opportunities, and this they see as an important and necessary component for successful implementation. I couldn't agree more. Tina's going to tell us a little bit about Louisiana. Okay, I'll do that.
Okay, I want to say something here before we fly down to Louisiana, that I have done Immersion 101 2 or 3 times with Tara, and you guys are getting in 1 hour what normally takes over a week.
It's true. So hang in there.
Yes, hang in there, but you guys are doing great, and this is, we carefully orchestrated this to power pack it, so thanks for hanging in there. Louisiana, this data, when I saw it at the Immersion 101, I thought this is it, we're on the right path opening Pierre Boitino in North Minneapolis. Let me orient you just a little bit. First, you want to know what you're looking at. So at the top it says this is the LEAP. That's the Louisiana Educational Assessment Program. So again, very comparable to the MCAs in the state of Minnesota. This is comparing 3 French immersion schools, French immersion, versus non-immersion or non-French immersion in for students. So the immersion students are in red, the non-immersion students are in blue, and then it also tracks students within those 2 categories who qualify for free and reduced lunch or who have paid lunch. It's got a P. What becomes immediately apparent is that, similar to the North Carolina data, our students in French immersion are ahead for both categories. And not only is their critical mass 1 level higher, and by the way, these levels are unsatisfactory, approaching basic, mastery, and advanced.
And these are the 2 that are considered proficient.
Right, so basic does not count. So we're looking for mastery and advanced, and you'll notice that the immersion students are shifted 1 whole category over for both paid lunch and free and reduced. And the numbers at advanced in both categories are higher for the French immersion students. And just a quick aside, there are no unsatisfactories in French immersion. Okay, that was for language arts. This one is for math. I'll give you a second just to look at it again now that you're oriented to the different colors and curves. Okay, we see some similarities to the last set of achievement scores. Again, higher achievement when you compare French immersion versus non-French immersion, and when you compare the 2 sets of students who qualify for free or reduced lunch. Similarly, both categories doing better at the advanced level for French immersion. And again, 0 at unsatisfactory. This was free and reduced lunch. Now I'm going to flip to a quote briefly that comes from Melanie Tennyson, who's the principal and now head of the whole organization for the International School of Louisiana in New Orleans. I'll give you a moment to take this in. So French immersion and immersion in general in Louisiana is working for students of multiple categories and is gaining some recognition as well. This next one, though, comes with a little caution, and this is a quote from the woman who, Michelle Hage-Broussard, who was the teacher educator, former French immersion teacher, who was, this was her graduate study, those LEAP comparisons that we saw just a minute ago. She took a minute to create a summary statement, and I think it's a very important one for you to see because, again, it shows a kind of a balanced view of the data. Want to highlight here that this data shows that immersion is not a panacea for ameliorating all the issues concerning African American student education. However, there are some benefits, and students are successful, and not only that, but we have this evidence of positive collective self-esteem that comes from increased language skills, higher LEAP scores in well-implemented immersion programs for both African American and white students.
Mm-hmm. Great. Perfect. Thanks, Tina. I want to call attention to one thing. This is the AC newsletter, which means that this report is online and available and can be downloaded. It's please go and check out our AC archives. Lots of newsletters, and anytime that I was able to come into contact with people who were doing dissertation studies that weren't actually being published, but had come up with some pretty interesting and compelling findings, we asked them to write an article about this for the AC newsletter, and so these articles are available to the public. One thing that I would also want to say is this quote here. I took a look did some investigating because I am concerned about overselling dual language and immersion. I don't believe it should be oversold. I believe it is a strong and great program model, has important achievement gap potential when well implemented and thoughtfully designed. Okay? But when we read quotes like this, we can think that it might be a panacea. In fact, the vast majority of the students at the International School of Louisiana are white, over half. The African American student population is really hovering around 20%. And that is a consistent finding and one that I know we need to keep in mind. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, now we're going west to the state of Oregon. Oregon right now, let me tell you first of all, this isn't a state level study, it's a district study. Because in the state of Oregon, Portland Public Schools has a long-standing history with dual language and immersion education. The first program started in 1989. As of this fall, there are 14 dual language and immersion programs in this one district, okay? One district. The data we're gonna be looking at now are data from the 10 dual language and immersion programs. They have the one-way model for targeting English-speaking children. They have a Mandarin, Japanese, and Spanish, and also they have, the majority of their programs are two-way. They have 6 Spanish-English programs and 1 Russian-English program, one of the few in the country. The 4 new programs I find very interesting because it's one of Vietnamese. We just have 1 or 2 Vietnamese immersion programs in the US. And Portland has just started 1 this fall. This is writing, actually, from the Portland Public School News just recently, 2014, but I think it's compelling to see what you think. As important as I think it is to get this information out about the potential of dual language and immersion programs, sometimes statements like this concern me because I'm not sure that we're being clear enough about the context and what we mean when we say well implemented. But one thing that I do really want to highlight here is that Portland Public Schools has established programs in collaboration with community, university, and research partners. And I would argue that that is one significant positive step in the direction of a well-implemented program. Okay, so what does this study look like? We're looking at this will be a 3-year study. There's collaborators with RAND Corporation, American Councils of International Ed, and this district, funded by U.S. Department of Education, Institute for Educational Services. There are 4 study goals, but I'm going to focus on these first 2. The goal of estimating the causal impact on student achievement in math, English, language arts, and science, and looking at how the program effect differs for native English speakers versus native speakers of the partner languages. And here we're going to be looking specifically at our Spanish immersion programs. Their Russian 2-way program is still quite young, so they don't have data yet from that particular program. But again, a step back, before I share these findings with you, I want to share a little bit more about the district. We need to understand the demographic context. So what we see here is the relative percentage of students from various ethnic backgrounds who are participating. This demographic information, I just want to share, again, it's very hard to come up with this because it's not typically in the reports. I'm not sure why, but this data you really have to do your homework to find. It's not easy. What we see is that Portland Public's 1-way immersion programs, again, Japanese, Chinese, and Spanish, mainly consist of students identified as white, Asian, or multiple, meaning multi-ethnic. In contrast, our 2-way students are coming from Hispanic and white families, with less than 10% representation of African American and multi-ethnic students. District as a whole, 55% white. Next most populous group are Hispanics, followed by African Americans, and less than 10% district-wide are students of Asian or multi-ethnic backgrounds. Let's take a look at other special services. The first one is the talented and gifted. What are the populations, what's the representation between our 1-way immersion, the orange bar, 2-way, and the district as a whole, right? How do they compare? And we see here the largest talented and gifted population, or the students receiving gifted and talented services, are in our 1-way immersion programs. Next largest is the district, and the least is in our 2-way. Free and reduced lunch, who's receiving those services? Over 50% in the 2-way immersion program. District at large, under 50%. Take a look again at the 1-way program. Significantly less students, that would be described as low income. Special education, who's receiving those services? And here you can see 2-way has a higher percentage, but the immersion programs are educating fewer students that have been identified with special needs. English learner population, as we would expect, and it's good to see this. Here we've got many students being served by the 2-way program. In the English learner population, almost none, very few in the 1-way programs, and that's relative to the district at large. Okay, I'm going to just show you two slides, and I like this because what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at a comparison between how are the 1-way immersion students achieving in the district. This is across grades, okay, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to the 11th grade. This is this program, they have some mature programs because they started in 1989 with their Japanese immersion program, right? Here's our numbers of 1-way versus 2-way. The 2-way has been a later initiative in the district, okay? The blue bar shows us how our 1-way students are achieving by grade level. Now remember, keep the demographic context in mind. We would expect these 1-way students to rock these achievement tests, right? The OAKS is Oregon state level assessment, right? Oregon Assessment of Knowledge and Skills. Everybody has their own acronym, right? But we're looking at 10-11 data. This is the area of math. This is what's impressive to me. The 2-way audience, look at over time the positive impact on that large group of low-income Latino English learners. That's impressive. And in reading, we see it replicated. Now, the numbers are very low, right, when we get up here, but 100% for both two-way students and one-way is an exciting finding, and we really do see that upwards trajectory. We're going to take questions later.
Are the purple bars people learning only in English, or are they learning in an immersion?
Okay. Yes. All of these are immersion students. This group here is in a two-way setting, right, where we have Spanish and English home language children, right? This one, they're all English home language children learning Mandarin, Japanese, and there's one Spanish program. Okay? So our comparison is whether or not you're a one-way or a two-way, both programs are learning about half of their instructional day during the elementary years are in a non-English language, both groups. Okay? All right. Another finding, and I think this one is quite interesting, that because in many immersion programs you have more demand than you have slots, ability to serve them, right? So that many programs use a lottery. Not everybody gets in, but you use a lottery. What they've learned is that winning the immersion lottery, in other words, becoming an immersion learner, keeps families in the district. And this is not an independent finding. I've read that same finding in many studies. So satisfaction in a dual language immersion context is something that can actually keep kids committed to the district and keep families there. Once again, we see, as we've seen before, these positive effects of dual language and immersion most apparent by grade 5 and beyond, and that our English learners appear to surpass non-immersion students in grade 5, but in Portland the difference was not found to be significant. Preliminary findings suggest persistence in immersion is important because benefits take time to accrue. Key points, I want to just summarize. We've taken a look at data from large and smaller scale studies in 3 different states. And before we go on to the Minnesota context, here's some summary points. Studies from these well-implemented dual programs are indicating academic achievement gains for a wide range of learner groups. Critical features of well-implemented dual language and immersion programs include features like a 1 grade level at a time initial rollout. I have seen too often when immersion programs start up K3 or K6 all in one fell swoop, they have more likelihood of not succeeding. Well-implemented districts, almost always, I've seen this across the country in my work, roll programs out 1 grade level at a time. Why? You are doing everything on your own. Curriculum, instruction, assessment. They hand you the English medium text and say, okay, do this in French. Hello? Okay, do this in Ojibwa. Excuse me? Well, when you try to do that curricularly and have the appropriate instructional strategies and good assessments in a non-English language, you're on your own. So taking it slow allows you to be successful. Other things, ongoing high-quality professional development support, hiring highly proficient teachers, etc., and teachers who really are able to meet the unique needs of the students in their program, absolutely critical. Keeping in mind, it's gradually over time, and that benefits increase after grade 5, so hang in there. And also remembering achievement studies in predominantly low-income Hispanic or Latino programs are few. We don't have a lot of data there. Here's one study that's fairly recent that actually focused specifically on this, taking a look at high-density 85 to 90% Hispanic students, 80 to 90% students on receiving free and reduced lunch. Okay? A very high-risk student population. And what they found was the students, when they did their comparison in these particular programs, they did find that the students were doing as well, if not in some cases slightly better than their non-immersion peers. However, they also write, segregated settings require carefully developed programs that meet the needs of students. Dual language programs have to be carefully developed to promote the positive outcomes for English learners, and EP means English proficient students. They went on to say, any educational program in segregated settings must be carefully designed to meet that unique demographics needs. Okay, I'm going to take you to Minnesota. Tina already introduced the 4 programs that we have nationally. And in Minnesota, these programs distill down to our Indigenous immersion in Ojibwa, Dakota, our bilingual 2-way immersion. And in Minnesota, we have Spanish-English programs and Hmong English dual language programs. And then our world language programs. And in Minnesota, we have these 5 languages. The relative percentages from the Minnesota context, 60% of our programs are one-way world language immersion programs. That's our majority model in Minnesota. We have a growing number of 2-way bilingual immersion programs, and they now make up almost 1/3 of our program models. And we also have a growing number of Indigenous and heritage immersion programs now. They are 13%. Minnesota's total number right now is 95. What's impressive about that is we grow programs in Minnesota not from top down, but we've grown them from grassroots up, and with way too little funding support. Here you see a breakdown of languages in Minnesota. Again, over half of our programs, here's the 1-way Spanish, here's our 2-way Spanish, okay? Over half of our programs target Spanish. Interestingly, and you might not have known this, but you'll leave today knowing our second most populous group is Mandarin immersion. We have 7 Mandarin immersion programs, early total, and I am hearing a buzz about a potential Mandarin immersion opening in Duluth Public Schools in the near future. Here's a sense of growth with our very first immersion program. It was Adam's Spanish immersion program in St. Paul Public Schools, opened in 1986 under the leadership of good old Howard Hathaway, some of you might remember. And if we take up to how we're still growing in Minnesota now, that's where we get to our current 95 programs. In Minnesota, we have programs all the way from pre-K to grade 12. Now, let's take a look at what can we say, how well are students of color specifically achieving in Minnesota dual language immersion programs. And the way we're going to look at this is doing school comparisons. Our anchor is going to be finding schools in the same district where they have similar numbers of low-income students, okay? So what we did was we went to the Minnesota report cards, combed through that to find a good demographic comparison. This is the Robbinsdale Public Schools, and Robbinsdale Spanish Immersion, one of our long-standing programs, opened back in 1989, compared to Zachary Lane Elementary, okay? So if we take those 2 programs and we take a look at how they're doing on the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments, what do we see? Blue is the Spanish immersion, red is the non-immersion. First, we'll take a look at the demographic differences. Again, we see in the Spanish immersion program a relatively higher percentage of our Latino. Both programs are predominantly white. In the immersion, higher percentage of Latino. In the non-immersion, higher percentage of African American and Asian students, okay? I'll give you a minute to take a look here. This is the percent proficient, right? What's the percent proficient in reading and math for these various subgroups? One thing that you need to keep in mind is that it's very difficult to make really good comparisons in Minnesota, and I'm going to tell you why. The data I'm showing you here are combining grades 3, 4, and 5. The best way to look at immersion student achievement is to look at how students are comparing grade 5 and beyond. Why? Because Zachary Lane students have had 100% of their instruction in English. So when they're being assessed in English on the MCA, only in English in grade 3, it's not really a fair comparison to the immersion group that has had 90% of their instruction in Spanish and initial literacy in Spanish, right? Unfortunately, we don't have a research study yet from Minnesota that allows us to really look at this the way it should be looked at, and we can't really get there from the way data is currently reported. Okay, so that's something that we need to keep in mind. We can see here both schools are outperforming the district average, but if you take a look at these districts, the other thing that's true is both of these schools have a much more privileged learner group than within this district. African American students in the dual language immersion program are performing as well or better than their peers in these demographically similar schools. However, the proportion of African American students participating is less than 10%. Asian Americans are performing somewhat better in the non-immersion schools, both in reading and math, and Latino numbers were unfortunately too small to provide comparisons with the non-dual language programs. That said, the Hispanic children are performing equally well in reading and math, and more than 50% are meeting or exceeding grade level standards. Okay?
Just to clarify, Robbinsdale Spanish version is a 1.
Correct. It is. It is a one-way program, although they do have a small English learner, Spanish home language population.
I worked there a few years ago.
You didn't at that time. Increasingly they are. The district has been encouraging more students, so it has been evolving and changing. Tina's going to talk about Minneapolis. Oops.
Okay, Minneapolis is our set of comparison schools for the demographic where the vast majority of students qualify for free and reduced price lunch. And in fact, I need to say right here that we've chosen Emerson and Pillsbury at 82.2 and 88.9% free and reduced respectively. However, most of the students in North Minneapolis and many in South Minneapolis, the percentages school-wide are 90% and higher. We have increasingly socioeconomic and racially segregated schools in our inner city schools. Okay, so we've got here we go. Now that you're familiar, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, want me to go?
Yes.
Okay.
You see a really similar demographic to the last slide, where a high number of Latino students attend Emerson and a higher relatively higher number of African Americans are than at Pillsbury. I do want to say one thing, because I know students at Pillsbury, we have limited labels for student groups. When it says African American, it includes African immigrants and families who have been in the United States for generations. So just to know that sometimes we have blankets that don't fit that well. Relatively small numbers of Asian American in both, and interestingly enough, in Minneapolis, with high numbers of free and reduced lunch students, you see a minority of white students. I'll give you a moment to take in the achievement data, remembering that the average for the district is in orange. The immersion school is always going to be in blue on these slides, and the non-immersion in red. So where can we say immersion is working for our students in a high-density free and reduced lunch setting? We see, I'll start at the bottom of the page, African Americans in immersion settings doing better than their district English-only peers by a lot, but again, in small density. Asian American, too small to compare. Latino, interestingly enough, this is where I want to make a comment to build on Tara's comment about Latinos and building that heritage language for Spanish speakers, because this is a dual language immersion program. So most of the Latinos in Emerson are English or Spanish home language, whereas Latinos may or may not be home language Spanish at Pillsbury. Again, the blanket doesn't necessarily fit. However, you see, so not only is it possible that students are getting that Spanish only, and we're going to see the benefits down the road, but we're also not necessarily talking even about the same students, Latino and Latino, within these two settings. And now we're going to move to 50-50.
So in contexts where we have between 50 and 55% of students receiving free and/or reduced lunch services, what does that look like? So we're going here across the river to St. Paul Public Schools, where we'll take a look at Adams Spanish Immersion, again, Minnesota's first immersion program, and we'll compare that to Highland Park, okay? Both of them in that range. Again, you see the enrollment differences with Adams Spanish Immersion, with that much higher proportion of Latino children, as we would expect in a two-way Spanish immersion program. And we see Highland Park with a much higher African American and Asian student population. Okay? And I'll give you a moment again to take in what we're learning, what we're seeing. Keep in mind, again, this is grade 3, 4, and 5. So you have to look at these data with a grain of salt. They're not giving us the information we really would like to see, which is grade 5 only, right? Orange bar district. So one of the things that I noticed right away is that really relative to the district average, these two programs are doing much better with those the groups that are the non-white groups, right? It is also true that relative to the rest of the district, their demographics would be considered privileged. Something to keep in mind. It's not really a fair comparison. But we do see the Latino students doing pretty well in reading. Again, we shouldn't really expect with grade 3, 4, and 5 combined data, we shouldn't expect to see them doing as well. And we don't. In math, again, not doing as well, but almost as well, because they're assessed only in English. And then with our African American student population, we're seeing these students, again, doing almost as well. That's really good relative to the students being educated in English only. And we see that in math, they're exceeding. One more slide, because this is the one we worked with St. Paul Public Schools to have them take a look and give us a comparison for Adams Spanish immersion students relative to the district's non-Spanish immersion students, grade 5 only. This is what we want to be able to see. And we were able to do this, it was related to another project that we worked on with the district. But I want to show you here, this is the MCA grade 5 data for reading. The blue bar is Adams Spanish immersion. We're looking at students receiving free and reduced lunch versus not, Latinos, African Americans, Caucasian, and overall. And when we really take a look at what's happening in grade 5, we see some exciting things. We see that students receiving free and/or reduced price lunch, here's our low income group, they're doing better in grade 5 in the immersion context. Latino students, this is not surprising again. Remember, we begin to see them closing the achievement gap in grade 5 and beyond. So we see a slight advantage here. That means they're on target with national data. African American students, again, with lower percentages, they're exceeding, they're outperforming, and Caucasian outperforming, and the students as a whole. So this is reading, and in math, it's even more so. I'll just give you a moment to take that in. Look at this gain here. Wow, twice as high, twice the achievement. Okay, Tina's now gonna take us into Pierre Bottino. Oops, sorry.
Okay. It is data like Spanish, Adam Spanish Immersion, and we're going to show you a little clip in just a moment from Milwaukee Spanish Immersion that really compelled me to take the reins and to open Pierre Bottino in North Minneapolis. But I want to say here, one thing that I can see so clearly in hindsight is we were looking at some really mature programs, and one thing that echoes throughout all of this data is for well-implemented programs, you see these benefits. So now we're going to switch gears just a little bit, and I'm going to take you to North Minneapolis, my home neighborhood. I live 5 blocks from where we opened the school. We started in 2012 after several years of planning and development. We almost opened in 2011, and we did not have sufficient enrollment, so we did wait a year, and there were lots of benefits that we gained in that extra year. I am no longer the school leader at Pierre Bottino. I'm on leave this year. The school has moved to City View. So just a few blocks on the other side of me, towards northeast, but still in North Minneapolis. Our student population was and still is about 85% students who qualify for free or reduced lunch, 80% and above students of color, and the vast majority of them are African American students. We had a beautiful vision statement we created together to offer a no excuses, excellent education to all of our students that includes the benefits of becoming proficient in French. And just a little aside about French, we chose French in part because the French-speaking world has a diversity, if you can imagine your colonial history, on all corners of the globe. And if you've been to North Minneapolis recently, you know that we have all corners of the globe right here in North Minneapolis as well. So we saw historic and identity connections for students from lots of different backgrounds within French immersion. Our school, that means the school is now 2.5 years old. I was with it for its first 2 years. We had, we opened K3, and we did full immersion in K1 and 2, and then in our upper grade, we did a French enriched model. So we don't have a ton of data on MCAs. In fact, our first year we had 8 students take the MCA. Out of 80 some students, only 8 of them were in 3rd grade, and the second year the data set was similar. So when I talk about successes today, I'm going to be talking a little bit more anecdotally and outside of academic achievement, because it's going to take a few years for there to be a significant achievement record at Pierre Bottino. We attracted the families we set out to serve. We were charged by the school board, and in fact I should take a moment here to introduce Cindy Moeller, who was the governing council chair for the years that I was the school leader at Pierre Bottino, and we were partners in crime through all of this launching of the school. We attracted the families that we were charged to attract. In other words, the school district said, we want you to serve the students who would otherwise be attending Minnesota's lowest 25% performing schools. And we did it. We brought in a large number of neighborhood families. We also attracted families who either were in North Minneapolis and would never have stayed. They would have gone to other districts, charter schools, or private schools, but we kept them in Minneapolis. And my favorite success story is what families said to us all the time. If you are a language immersion educator in this room, you know what I'm talking about when the parents come up to you and say, I can't believe what my baby can do. My favorite story about this is a parent who called me up and said, Madame Tina, we were out at a store and the storekeeper spoke French and my first grader had a conversation with him. The learning that happens in immersion programs is on kids' sleeves, and it's something that gives them a sense of accomplishment because they can see that learning, but also because the community and their parents can see that learning happening. And I don't have a video of Pierre Bottino, but I do have what I would call an inspirational video that Cindy and I went to Milwaukee French Immersion the year before we opened to look at their school, which was demographically very similar to the one that we were hoping to launch, Milwaukee French Immersion. So in this, you'll hear parents talk about how they feel about French Immersion, and you'll get a chance to see a couple of French Immersion students.
It's an excellent experience, and I'm really glad she's getting a chance to be exposed to it. So, great. I guess the most important thing is get children, get the community advised early, because they need to start in kindergarten or first grade. I think is a limit in order to start it. But now that she said she loves it, and I'm so impressed with what she's learning every day.
My daughter, she's very, very, bright in the subject. Blows my mind sometimes. So it's definitely an awesome experience to get your kids involved in French immersion.
Do you feel like they learn all their subjects?
Definitely. I mean, she knows math, English, all the different subjects in French. It's just like she's teaching me.
We got an opportunity to really embrace another culture. And I think that's the biggest thing.
I'm getting educated along with the kids at the same time, so it's great.
Oh, I know it was a very short little moment there, but just to put it in context for you, we went to Milwaukee French Immersion hoping to get a little inspiration for what we were about to do. And the moment that we walked into the parent pickup area in the auditorium, and we thought, I wonder if we can find any parents of color who could talk to us. It was only parents of color, and this is what they had to say. And then the kids were just overflowing with their enthusiasm for the French. It was really neat. Challenges. We have faced a lot of challenges in our first 2 years, and they are, for the most part, not uncommon given for new immersion programs. So, immersion programs need a lot of extra support in their early years. Tara mentioned earlier that you're handed a textbook from the district and they expect you to teach it in French. You have a lot of curriculum writing, planning, and extra professional development to do in order to be able to pull off French immersion. We were a self-governed school, and that meant that we only got the dollars that our students brought in, so we did not have the benefit of what some districts offer, which is a huge upfront investment. And I think that that's one that's very necessary to get off to a strong start. Finding qualified staff. It is not easy to find someone who is highly proficient, native quality speaker in French, who's licensed or licensable in the state of Minnesota. And ideally, they would already be licensed and experienced, not just licensed, but really an experienced teacher, because if they're not, then they're going to be in grad school their first 3 years while they're trying to figure out how to teach in your program, and that's hard work for them and for everybody. And then finally, for us, and this is something that came up in one of the data sets that we saw just a moment ago, I think it was North Carolina, was that if you're, no, it was Oregon actually, because they talked about the segregated program. So we have a program that's highly students of color and especially African American, and our teachers, guess, our teachers were all white teachers, and and because so many of them were brand new to teaching, the potential for there to be a culture gap and one where we weren't meeting all of our students' needs was very high, and we lost 50% of our teachers both years. So if I had it to do over again, I would launch this school with a lot more money and teachers who were already really effective in the context. Now, we looked for the best ones that we could, and we have found some excellent teachers, but that culture gap is something that is not to be underestimated. And this is going to take us to talk about what we believe the needs and next steps are for the state of Minnesota.
And I'll do this really quickly because I know we've gone over. Thank you for your patience. First, We need a well-designed, large-scale study on how dual language and immersion students are doing in Minnesota. That's point number one. In order for us to keep up, and in order for us to really adequately argue with the state legislature for this, right? If we don't have an inspired governor like they've got in Utah and Delaware, then what we need is to come up with some data as to why this program and how this program can and is making a difference. But we have to critically consider both the demographic and the programmatic context. Again, going back to what does it look like to have a well-designed program, and are we really seeing that in pretty segregated schools with a very, very high-risk demographic? How much evidence do we have that dual language and immersion programs are successful there? We need to apply best practice of well-implemented programs, create state-level infrastructure, because what Tina was just talking about, we need help with recruitment, hiring, professional development, and teacher retention. We have to educate and reach out to some of our underrepresented students, but really educate and be educated about how we're doing it. In other words, not be doing things that, not over-enrolling certain demographics unless we have ensured sufficient and adequate teacher support. We need that vision for the long-term commitment. We have to maintain fidelity to what high-quality research-supported program design looks like. And finally, we need to consider if, in fact, other states are being successful with this, there's absolutely no reason, if we keep our eye on that well-implemented thing about program design and implementation, that Minnesota cannot get there too. So there's our message, and here's our immersion. Thank you.
And thank you both. Thank you, Tina. I'm sorry to say we're actually out of time, so we don't have time for questions, but could the two of you stick around a little bit, because I have some really good questions in my pocket. But because we keep this to 90 minutes, so when we put it on